Hello, patrons and subscribers. This is Random Rob. Welcome back to the new show. Today I'm talking about H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. And what I'd like to do here is talk about a couple of notable adaptations of the book and then talk about the book last. Now, if there's one American cultural event surrounding War of the Worlds that's still remembered to this day, would be Orson Welles' notorious Halloween of 1938 radio broadcast. Welles presented it mostly as if it was information being relayed by a live reporter, and it employed sound effects and other tricks to get the audience into believing that what was going on was really real. Despite the fact that the broadcast also clearly had sections that were narrated in a much more theatrical way where it was obvious this was a radio play, despite the fact that disclaimers were made regularly throughout the broadcast that this was not a real news report, the panic and paranoia of most Americans was such at that point that they failed to notice those things. And this broadcast for a few hours created a genuine panic throughout much of the middle of the country. My mother was living in Illinois with her family at the time, and she recalled that my grandfather got out his shotgun and stood out on the porch until it became clear that it was a bit of theater. Welles had to publicly apologize. There was so much negative reaction from people in the press. Now, a film adaptation of War of the Worlds had been something that Hollywood was working on since the 1920s. Cecil B. DeMille originally bought the rights to it. There were plans of making a film of the War of the Worlds in the 1930s with Alfred Hitchcock attached to direct, but it never came together. After Welles' broadcast, some film studios tried to get Welles interested in directing, but Welles would have nothing to do with it. And it wasn't until 1953 that War of the Worlds would end up coming to the screen in the adaptation by George Pal. Truly one of the first special effects extravaganzas of its day. The film had a budget of $2 million. Of that $2 million, 70% of that went towards special effects. I loved this film as a child. As an adult, I still marvel at the miniature effects. I think the modern versions of the tripods that were created by designer Albert Nozaki were really modern and cool looking. I still think they're cool looking. The way they silently glide along like swans, as opposed to the more steampunk iron tripods of the Welles story. Interestingly, part of the reason George Pal wanted the tripods to have a more modern look was because he was told by military advisors from the U.S. military, who he contacted to work on the film, that the tripods as described in Welles' story would be no match for the U.S. military. They modernized them. In addition to the heat ray, they gave them a neutron beam which would disintegrate anything it hit. And of course, the impenetrable deflector shield, which had become ubiquitous in alien invasion stories. The Martian machines they built for the PAL movie were incredibly heavy. They were built out of copper over a wooden frame. They had 20 wires going to them to control movement and also power the lights that were inside them. In several shots in the movie, you can clearly see the wires coming out of the top of them. They're quite noticeable. The last third of the film, PAL had originally intended to become a 3D movie. And that at the point where the scientists in the military put on goggles to view the atom bomb blast, that was the point where the audience was going to put on 3D glasses, and the ending was going to be entirely 3D, but it never worked out. Too bad, really, because the scenes of the aliens laying waste to Los Angeles is probably some of the most beautiful model work done at that time. in addition to the wonderful special effects, were the sound effects. I was reading how the neutron beam sound effect was made by taking a hammer to an enormous empty oil drum and then cutting off the sound of the hammer impact and just playing the rest of the echo. They also did things like attaching a off-center wooden disc to a drill and then rubbing that along the strings of an electric guitar. In fact, the articles I read on the sound effects of the film seem to state that all of the sound effects, including the heat ray in the George Pal film, were made using an electric guitar, but I am pretty certain the heat ray firing effect is the sound of a starter on a truck being played in reverse and sped up. Wee, 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 wee. That never sounded like a sound that was made with a guitar. Aside from rewriting the story to fit with a modern American pro-military 1950s narrative, the film would also hang the climax of the War of the Worlds on God. In 2005, when Steven Spielberg released his version of the War of the Worlds starring Tom Cruise, he would also make that narrative change. 2005 War of the Worlds, while I don't think it's a perfect film, it is one of my favorite Steven Spielberg movies. Primarily because I love it when Steven Spielberg does horror. I think he's very underrated as a horror director. I wish he would do a straight-up horror movie. The first tripod attack scene that occurs in the 2005 film, I still think is one of the best alien invasion horror sequences committed to film. Spielberg is a director who intuitively understands that you don't just create something large and threatening like a Martian tripod or a dinosaur by strictly using computer-generated images. You mix and match your practical elements, your CG elements, your sound elements in combination to get the audience to suspend their disbelief as much as possible. It's also frustrating in a way because the first tripod attack scene in the Spielberg War of the Worlds is so effective. Some of the later sequences with the tripods where you see them in full frame seem a little more hinky, especially when they move in a jellyfish type way, even though they're supposed to be metal structures. I didn't think that choice really worked. You know, if you want something to move mechanically, have it move mechanically. Giving something that's mechanical an organic movement pattern, I don't know. The Spielberg film is much closer to the narrative focus and tone of the Wells book in that it is primarily about fleeing the destruction and trying to get away. The film is filled with some really strong imagery that references refugee experiences, Holocaust experiences, 9/11 experiences, especially the detail of when the Tom Cruise character returns to his house after the tripod attack and he's covered in bloody ash. That's a very noticeable 9/11 reference. And I remember at the time the film was released, there was some pushback against that. There was an article, or I guess a review. I can't remember if it was in the Times or the Washington Post, and the title was something like, "Are audiences ready for 9/11 imagery?" Years before Man of Steel. Different time. But that's what I love about this film. There's parts of it that are genuinely terrifying and disturbing. And the fact that the Tom Cruise character is not a great dad pushes it up a notch. I like when Tom Cruise plays against type. Like Edge of Tomorrow, where his character is a coward. I like Tom Cruise when he's not a badass. He gets the chance to actually act. I think the scenes of tension between him and his children in the movie are terrific. The scene where the son is trying to get one of the army jeeps to stop so he can join them, and the daughter yells at the brother, what are you doing? You can't leave me here. Who's going to take care of me? While the father is standing right there. Brutal. A lot of reviewers did not care for Tim Robbins' performance. I don't really have a problem with Tim Robbins in War of the Worlds, as his character was clearly modeled after the character of the curate from the H.G. Wells book. Some of his dialogue and outbursts are pretty close to the discussions that the narrator and the curate have in War of the Worlds. My biggest logical problem with Spielberg's movie is the idea of the tripods being buried underground for millions of years, and somehow that going unnoticed by an industrial species of humans who routinely do mining and drilling into the Earth's crust. I think someone would have noticed those machines at some point. But whatever, the tripod bursting out of the ground, it's such an iconic scene, I'm willing to forgive that. Or a man clearly being shown using a camera phone to make a video of what's going on with the tripod when we had just been shown in the previous scene that an EMP had knocked out power all across Manhattan. I have a feeling that sequence might have been shot, and then later the continuity person said, hey, that doesn't really work with what we've set up, but, somebody decided, put it in anyway. Wells' novel is from 1897, and probably most significant in literary terms because this was one of the first science fiction novels to have a bleak, apocalyptic narrative. And while there are a lot of literary discussions around the fact that Wells' book was prescient, that a world war was coming, when I read the book a few summers ago, that wasn't really the impression I got. I felt more that Wells was channeling, if anything, concern that Britain, having risen to worldwide prominence as an industrial nation with a powerful navy, was becoming complacent. War of the Worlds was a book I struggled to read as a child. I never got through it when I was younger. As an adult, I was really impressed with how detail-oriented it was. It really gave you the feeling of being in the middle of the ebb and flow of a battle across a very specific part of the British countryside. And I love the section of the book where the narrator's brother or cousin is in Essex when they are trying to evacuate ferries full of people out of the city, and a British naval vessel, the Thunderchild, manages to down 2 Martian tripods before it's destroyed. Almost 90% of the War of the Worlds, the novel, is a very detail-oriented story. We don't know much about the narrator. We know very little about the characters he comes in contact with. Most of the characters in the book are not named. The most significant character who the narrator meets is the curate, who believes that Martian attack is the biblical prophecy of Armageddon coming true. And it's made very plain through the narrator's perception of the curate that the curate's ideas about Armageddon and the Martians being a wrath of God are not helpful and socially backwards. And in fact, it's the curate ranting to the high heavens that ultimately causes him to be captured by the Martians and having his blood removed, which was a really gruesome touch that I was also very glad that Spielberg kept in his adaptation, as well as the idea that the Martians were planting this red weed that was growing everywhere. Very early conceptualization of terraforming. Now, at the end of the novel, The War of the Worlds, when the Martians are finally defeated by their lack of immune response to terrestrial bacteria, sidebar, the whole idea of aliens getting sick from terrestrial bacteria or humans getting sick from alien bacteria actually doesn't really make any sense, because all bacteria and viruses that we know of are specifically based on the DNA of the organism they infect. The idea of aliens becoming sick from terrestrial bacteria would only make sense if the aliens had the same DNA as human beings. So that's not really a thing. Nevertheless, Wells' book does not attribute bacteria destroying the Martians as an act of God. It suggests it Might be, but never comes down either way. Wells was agnostic. He didn't believe that the existence of God could be proven or disproven, so there was no point really thinking about it. And he was part of the Fabian Society, which was a socially progressive movement of writers and philosophers who believed that the only way the problems of the modern world could be dealt with properly was by getting people from different classes and different races together and talking one-on-one. The bureaucratic analog today of the Fabian Society would be the United Nations. Part of the reason I giggle whenever people say, well, the United Nations doesn't have any real power. Like, duh, they never did. The point is to advance social progress through discussion. But touching again on God, God was not a focus of the climax, yet it is an idea that's associated with War of the Worlds because of film adaptations, like the 1953 version and the 2005 version. I can understand the rationale behind it. You know, if you want to attract a general audience, you might not want to have your film about a miracle saving humanity not be the work of some divine agency that's looking out for us. I personally think the implication of Wells' novel is that the mystery and complexity of the natural world might actually be far more mysterious and powerful than a human conception of a creator. But Wells was not writing for an audience of atheists. I think his attribution was really just a way to not piss off any of his readers more than trying to insert God in the story. In general, ideas about God were not something Wells pushed in any of his writings. Alright, so thanks for listening to this loose discussion of the War of the Worlds and some of its adaptations. There have been countless direct-to-video versions of the story. Also, I believe some TV series have come out since. I have not seen any of those. If there's any you would recommend to me, put them in the comments below. And if you like what you heard, please press the like button and subscribe, and consider becoming a patron of the new show. Alright, this is Random Rob signing off till next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.